Welcome to this beginner's course to Blender 3D, the open source 3D animation and modeling software available from the Blender Foundation. Today we're going to be taking you through all of the fundamentals of using Blender 3D to create a simple animation. You're only going to require Blender itself in terms of the software for this course. By the end of this course, you should have a good understanding as to how to use Blender's interface, as well as how to create basic 3D models, apply textures, materials and lighting, and even create your first animation all within the Blender platform. So if you've not already done so, go to blender.org and then you'll see that there's an option to download the latest version of Blender. At the time of recording, we have Blender version 4.3 accessible. Click on the download option, but this will take you to the download page. There will then be a blue button which you can press to begin the traditional installation process. Make sure underneath that you have the correct operating system set for when you click this button. If it's not correct, just access this menu right here and choose the correct option. By the way, you can also, if you wanted to, download Blender from Steam. Just click on this link and it will open up Steam, where you can also download Blender 3D. When you open up Blender for the first time, you'll be meted with the splash screen. This will have an image on the top which helps to represent the current version of Blender that you are using, along with the actual version code located in the top corner, as well as on the bottom half access to the different file templates, the ability to open recent files that you have been working on, accessing online options such as the ability to donate to the Blender Foundation, or accessing the latest update release notes. If you don't require any of these though, you can simply left click away from the splash screen to close it, and to bring it back, just go up to the icon in the top corner, open the menu and select splash screen. Blender is a 3D modeling software. Therefore, a part of this interface allows us to navigate in 3 dimensions. By default, this is located here. This is the 3D viewport, and this is where we will be creating our 3D models. But before I move on to actually navigating 3D space, let's just take a quick look at the interface itself. You have the basic menus for any application located here, such as the File and Edit menu. You also have additional menus for Render, Window, and Help. Help at the end allows us to access online documentation that may support us if we are stuck when using Blender in any way. Besides these menus, we also have what are known as workspaces. Blender can be used to follow specific workflows. The general workflow is to create 3D models used for rendered images or animations. Many of these tabs that you see here will allow you to change the setup of the Blender interface to suit the task that you are trying to perform within Blender. For example, if you want to add materials to your model, you would come to the shading workspace. If you had rendered an image and you wanted to edit the image itself, you can come over here to the compositing workspace. If you want to use your own code to run certain applications in Blender, you could use the scripting workspace. So each of these tabs accesses a workspace that allows you to use different tools within Blender. Below this, we have the specific panels used by Blender to store editors. Each editor houses its own set of tools. For example, the largest panel here uses the 3D viewport. This panel in the top corner represents the outliner panel. The one below it is the properties panel, and the one below the 3D viewport is the timeline. This can be used to play back animations. In addition to this, we also have the ability to change the editor type within each panel. The location of this menu will always be in the same place, in the top corner. So with the 3D viewport, for example, I can click on this icon, which actually represents the current editor being used, and I can change to any of the other editor types accessible in Blender. For example, I can change to the asset browser. Maybe I would change to the texture node editor. Maybe I can go back to the 3D viewport. You will also notice next to many of these options, we have grayed out text. This represents the hotkey or keyboard shortcut that you can use to activate that tool. In this case, the tool refers to the ability to change your current editor in a specific panel. So for example, if we wanted to access the Python console, we would hold down Shift and use F4. Alternatively, if we wanted to go back to the 3D viewport, we would use Shift and F5 on our keyboard. Another way in which we can change our layout is to come over to the intersection between two panels and click and drag. This allows us to resize the panels connected to that intersection. If I want to make my outliner smaller, for example, I can click and drag on the intersection between the outliner and the properties panel. Click and drag, bring that up, and it makes the outliner panel smaller so that I can see more within the properties panel. If I want to swap the editors used in two different panels, I can right click on the intersection and this will bring up the area options menu. I can then from here select the swap area option. This is going to swap the timeline with the 3D viewport in my example. I can right click and swap areas to join them back again. I can also increase the number of panels I have accessible by accessing the same menu and choosing either vertical split or horizontal split. Here I'm going to choose horizontal split, find where I want the new intersection to be and left click. This is going to divide the current workspace into two. However, what I can do is I can go to the editor menu and I can change the newly created panel to a new editor. In this case, I might want to add the shader editor to this workspace. If I want to do the opposite and join panels together, I can again go to the same intersection and either join up or join down. In this case, I want to get rid of my shader editor, so I'm going to use the join down option so that the 3D viewport takes up that space and becomes the only editor using that space on my screen. If you want to maximize the space that you have available for a specific editor, you can hold down the Control key and press spacebar. Note that if you are using a Mac, Control will be replaced by Command. So Control and spacebar while your mouse hovers the 3D viewport, and it will maximize the screen for the 3D viewport alone, leaving only the original menus at the top of the Blender interface. This gives you plenty of room to work with in your chosen panel or editor. While in this state, there's a back to previous button that you can use to return to the original layout. Keep in mind that this works depending on where your mouse cursor is positioned. So if I want to make the properties panel full screen, I can go Control and spacebar, and this will make the properties panel nearly full screen with the exception of the top. Again, I can either use the same hotkey, which is Control spacebar, or I could use that back to previous option that we used before. For much of this course, we're going to be working in the 3D viewport. So for now, I'm going to use Control and spacebar to maximize the potential area of the viewport. We will be using other panels eventually for different tasks, but most of what we need to learn as a beginner is focused on the 3D viewport itself. In addition to maximizing my panel, I'm going to make one other change. I'm going to go to the Edit menu and then go to Preferences. In the Preferences panel, we have access to many of the system settings or the tools and settings that allow us to change how Blender itself operates. Now, under the system settings, you have the ability to choose your cycles render devices. You're not going to need to change this in today's course because we're not going to be using cycles, we're going to be using Eevee for when we render our animation. But for future reference, choose the option here that is compatible with your graphics card if you have it. For example, I have an NVIDIA GTX or RTX 3080, so I would use the optics option for cycles rendering. However, the real reason I'm here is to go to interface and make sure that I have a good resolution scale. This is simply going to change the size of all the text elements within the Blender interface. For me, I'm going to change this to 2.2, and this is more so that you can see as clearly as possible all of the different options as we go through the course. This will save automatically, so just click on the X button in the top corner to close the Preferences panel. Within the 3D viewport, the primary method of navigation is to orbit your view. To orbit your view, hold down the middle mouse button on your mouse. Then move the mouse in any direction. You should be able to navigate or orbit around the cube that is located at the center of the 3D viewport. So as I click down on the middle mouse button and begin to move the mouse itself, I can navigate around the viewport using a method known as orbiting. Alternatively, I can zoom in and out of my cube object by scrolling up to zoom in or scrolling down to zoom out. Note that this does not always work straight away on your selected model. It works on the cube to start with because our view is actually focused at the center of our Blender grid system, which is where these red and green lines intersect within the cube. There is also a secondary method of zooming known as a dolly zoom. Hold down the Control or Command key on your keyboard, then hold down the middle mouse button and move up with your mouse to zoom in and back to zoom out. A third method of navigation is to pan our view. To do this, hold down the Shift key and the middle mouse button and then move your mouse. If you move your mouse to the right, then the view will move to the left. If you move the mouse to the left, then the view will move to the right. Move the mouse up to shift the view down, and then vice versa to move up. So we have the ability to orbit, zoom, dolly zoom, and pan. And these are the fundamental ways in which we can navigate in Blender. But you will notice that as I zoom, we're no longer moving towards the center point. We've actually shifted what the center point of our focus is. And this is because we used that panning feature. So if you want to correct this, if you want to focus your view on a specific object, for example, select that object, which we can do by left clicking, and it will be highlighted. Then you can press either the period key on your number pad if you have it, or you can go to View and you can choose the Frame Selected option. So this is what I'm going to do now. I'm going to select Frame Selected, and it's going to zoom in on my cube object. Now I'll zoom out and orbit, and you'll see that the view has perfectly reset based on the positioning of the selected cube. If I select another object, such as this object right here, which is actually our light source, and then press the period key this time on my number pad, you'll see that we zoom in on this new object, and we can use our various navigation tools for this object specifically. If I want to select another model, such as this camera object, then I just select it by left clicking, press the period key, and you'll see it zooms in on this little dot right here. We'll come back to this in a few moments, but this is what is known as an object's origin point, and all objects will have an object's origin in Blender. For now, I'm going to reselect the cube object and use the period key to once again zoom in on that model. If you don't have that period key, by the way, just as a reminder, you can just use the frame selected option from this menu. To the side of our 3D viewport, we have this interactive axes, and this is another way of navigating in 3D space. We can hover over to create what appears to be a grey circle, and then we can click and drag within this circle to begin navigating or orbiting around our view. This can be quite useful if you have a laptop, for example, and don't have access to a mouse. It just requires you to hover the mouse cursor within the circle, left click, and then move your mouse or touchpad. So it doesn't require the middle mouse button in this example to navigate. These coloured options here, Z, Y, and X, they represent the 3 axes. You can move into a specific axis position by clicking any of these options. So X to take us to what is known as the front orthographic view. Y would take us to either the back orthographic view or front orthographic view. If we go with the negative X from here, we can go to the left orthographic view. The Z option will take us to the top, and if we press it again, we can go to the bottom. So these are the 2-dimensional views that we can access using this navigation axis. Alternatively, if you have a number pad, you can press 1 to go into front orthographic view, 3 to go into right orthographic view, 7 to go into top orthographic view, and 9 to reverse the view of the previous option. So 1 and 9 to go back, 3 and 9 to go left, 7 and 9 to go bottom. We also have the ability to toggle between perspective and orthographic. The only thing you need to really know at this time is perspective adds depth to the 3D viewport, whereas orthographic will eliminate depth. If we press 5 on our number pad, this will take us into orthographic view. If we press 5 again, it will take us to perspective view. If you come over to the 4 buttons, the button at the bottom is going to also allow us the same functionality. So we can click on this button to go between orthographic and perspective views. The first button here is a zoom button, so we can click and drag, and this is another way in which we can zoom. The move option, which is the hand icon, this would allow us to pan our view. And the third option is one that allows us to toggle the camera view. So I'm going to left click, and this will move into the view of the camera object. This is important as anything that you want to render, either as a still image or an animation, is going to be visible within this frame. So anything outside of this camera's frame will not be rendered when you click on that render image or render animation button. You can leave the camera view at any time just by orbiting as normal. And finally, you can re-access the camera's view more quickly if you have the number pad and press 0. So press 0 on your number pad to toggle this view. Now that we understand how to navigate 3D space, let's take a look at object manipulation. First of all, we can select objects by left-clicking on them. By default, left-clicking will select one object each time, and you'll see that it is highlighted when it is selected. If we want to select multiple objects, hold down the Shift key and left-click. This will add new objects to our selection. It will also ensure that the last object selected becomes the active object. So you'll see that they are highlighted in different colors, one for the active object and another for the other selected objects. This will be important for many tools that you use in Blender later on. To select everything, you can press the A key. So I'm just going to left click to deselect everything and then press A to select all of the objects in my viewport. I can also press Alt and A at the same time to deselect, but I don't tend to use this very often because you can just left click anywhere where the objects are not present and this will deselect all of the models in your viewport. We can name our objects if we wish by left clicking on the object to select it and then pressing the F2 button. This will bring up a prompt that allows us to change the object name. So in this example, I'm going to change cube to box and then press enter. You can see the name of the selected object here at the top corner of the 3D viewport. You can also see the collection that it is part of. More on that later on. The more traditional method, however, for renaming models is in fact with the outliner panel. So for the moment, I'm just going to go back to the original layout where we can see the outliner panel. We can double click on any of these objects and this will allow us to rename that object. For example, let's change light to lamp and this changes the name of that specific object. We can change camera to camera 1, for example, if we plan to use more than one camera for our rendered images or animations. This is the more traditional method for changing the name, but both methods work just as well. For now, let's move back to our maximized 3D viewport. We will want to sometimes delete models from our scene that we don't require. It is a common meme almost for Blender users to start a project by deleting a default cube. So we're going to do that right now. To delete a selected object, left click to make sure it is selected, then press either the X button or the delete button. Now these two do the same thing, but there is a slight difference. If I was to press the X button, I would get a prompt that allows me to either confirm the ability to delete an object or the ability to cancel the operation. So in this case, let's cancel. The alternative is to press the delete key on our keyboard. If I press delete, I don't get any prompt and Blender will just delete the model. This is now a good opportunity to demonstrate a very powerful tool known as the undo feature. So let's say I just deleted my object by accident. To bring it back, I would simply have to undo that previous step. Hold down the Control or Command key on your keyboard and press the Z button, or Z if you're using English from Britain like me. This will bring the object back because the previous action that we made was to delete the model. So by using Control Z, we reverted back to a state before we used the delete option. You're going to be using this quite a lot in Blender going forward. For now though, I do actually want to delete this object and replace it with a new one. I'm going to press X this time and confirm that I want to delete the model. So now the cube object has been removed from the 3D viewport and the project as a whole. Next, I'm going to add a new object. I can do this by coming up to the Add menu, which is located here. This will allow me to select the object type, which can range from meshes to curves, to grease pencils, to even empty images. And then I can choose the specific objects within that object type. So here, we're going to be working primarily with mesh objects, and I'm going to choose from this list monkey. Before I do that, I want to highlight that you may not see any of the options below the monkey option, and that's because I have an extension that is added. But we're not going to be covering any extensions in this video, so don't worry about any of these options you see here. I'm going to choose monkey, and it's going to add the monkey object known as Suzanne to our scene. So now we have deleted our cube object and replaced it with a Suzanne object instead. Because we are working in 3 dimensions, we need to learn how to manipulate the transforms of a model. Before I go any further, I'm going to press the N key on my keyboard. By pressing N, I open up what is known as the side panel. Here we have the values for our main model transforms. These are the location, rotation, and scale. There's a fourth one labelled as dimensions. These represent the actual size of the model in our viewport. The scale allows us to increase the size relative to a default structure. More on that a little bit later. For now, let's take a look at how we can manipulate these transforms. One way to do it is within the side panel. We can click and drag on a location transform, for example, such as the X value, and this will allow us to move the model on the X axis. If I right click while using any operation in Blender, I can cancel it, which I've just done here. I can also move the object on the Y axis or the Z axis. From here, we can also rotate our model on the X, Y, or Z axes, and we can also scale on these axes as well. You'll notice as we manipulate the scale that we can also manipulate the actual dimensions of the model located directly below. And if we wanted to, we can actually manipulate the dimensions themselves, and this too would affect the scale. So they are effectively interchangeable, but the dimensions represent the actual measurements on each axis. There are other ways in which we can manipulate the transforms of a model. For example, on the other side of the viewport, we have the toolbar. We can select transform tools from this location. For example, the move tool allows us to move our object. So we just click and drag on this gizmo that has appeared, and we're able to move the model. We can manipulate any of the coloured arrows to move and change the location of the model on specific axes. So we can move on all axes, or we can move on singular ones. By the way, I've just made a lot of changes. So one thing that I can do here, if I want to revert this back to the center, is click and drag down to select all 3 of my location values in the side panel, and then press 0 and enter. This will just reset my object back to the center of the scene. There are other ways which we can do that, of course, but that's an easy enough method for beginners to start with. We also have access to the rotate tool, which allows us to rotate using different methods. So if we select the white line that goes along the outside, we can rotate based on the view within the viewport. If we click and drag on the inside, we can use a method known as trackball rotation, which is a more free-flowing method of rotating our objects. And we can click any of the coloured lines to rotate on a specific axis. Again, that's blue for the Z axis, red for the x-axis and green for the y-axis. Then we have the ability to scale. Again, we can scale in all directions by clicking and dragging within the white circle, or we can click on any of the different colors to scale on that specific axis. There are a few other methods in which allow us to manipulate the transforms of models, but these are the basic ones. The last I'm going to show you though is for the hotkeys. So if we press G, we can move an object. If we press R on our keyboard, we can rotate it. If we press S, we can scale it. If we press a transform button, such as G, R, or S, I'm going to press G, and then press one of the axes buttons, so X, Y, or Z, then we can lock a transform to a specific axis using that specific hotkey combination. Let's now look at the ability to manipulate the geometry of a model itself. To keep things simple, I'm going to go back to the cube object that we had earlier. So I'm going to come up to the selection tool in the toolbox so we can get rid of the gizmo, and then we're going to press X and delete the selected object. Then I'm going to add a new object, and this time I'm going to use the hotkey, which is Shift and A. This brings up the add menu within the viewport itself, and I'm going to go to Mesh, and I'm going to select Cube from this menu. So this is a very basic shape in which we can learn how geometry works by manipulating this model. We can begin to manipulate our geometry by changing the mode within the 3D viewport. To do this, go up to where it says Object Mode, left click, and then select Edit Mode. For the remainder of this course, I want you to just ignore the 4 options underneath Edit Mode. We won't be using them. So we're going to select Edit Mode, and the object is going to look slightly different. And for starters, all of the geometry is going to be selected by default. Just left click anywhere away from the model to deselect everything. When working with mesh objects, there are 3 types of geometry. A vertex is a single point on the model. An edge is the connected line between 2 vertices. A face is a closed loop of edges where at least 3 edges are used to create that face. In the case of our cube, we have faces on each of these 6 sides, and each face has 4 edges and 4 vertices. You can select a vertex by left clicking. It will become highlighted. So any vertex on our model can be selected. We can also hold down the Shift key to begin selecting multiple vertices. You'll see that once I select certain vertices on our model, the face used to construct them is going to be highlighted. Alternatively, we can change the type of geometry that we want to select by coming up to these 3 icons here. It's currently set to vertex select, but I can change to edge select here, and this will allow me to select individual edges or multiple edges by using the Shift key. If I need to, I can even go to face select and start selecting entire faces. So I can select multiple faces with the Shift key or a single face just by left clicking. The transforms that we previously looked at also apply to selected geometry. When it comes to faces, we have the ability to grab, rotate, and scale our selected geometry, but also note it will affect the geometry that is connected to it as well. When it comes to our edges, we are slightly more limited. We can grab the geometry, we can rotate it, and we can scale it. But the scale is limited to the length of the edge that we want to create because there are only 2 points to work with. When it comes to vertices, we can only change the location of a vertex. Because it's a single point, we cannot rotate the vertex itself, nor can we scale the vertex. We can only move it to start off with. If you take a look at the toolbar, you'll see it has been extended quite significantly. We now have the ability to edit the geometry beyond just manipulating its transforms. There are many more tools to learn than what you can see here, but let's just take a look at a few of the basic ones that will allow you to get started. For example, I'm going to take the top face of this cube, and I'm going to left click on this option here. This is for the extrude tool. You'll see a gizmo appears at the center of the selected geometry, and if I click and drag on this gizmo, it will allow me to extrude or create new geometry where we had the original face. We can select this new geometry and manipulate it in a similar way. So I can use the extrude tool multiple times to begin creating brand new shapes very quickly. So here we've been able to create a new shape just by using a single tool, which is the extrude tool. The next option that I would like to cover is the inset faces tool. Here we can select a face, click and drag, and this will allow us to create new geometry. But when we create that new geometry, which is kind of similar to the scale tool, or the extrude tool I should say, we instead scale in the original face. So everything is still on the same plane if you like, but we're now actually extruding and then scaling directly inwards, which is slightly different to the extrude tool, where we can click and drag, and this will change the actual shape of the model straight away. By the way, we can use extrusions to extrude out or into our geometry, just as I've done right here. Another great tool to learn is the bevel tool. This allows us to take a specific edge, so we need to be in edge select for this, and then it allows us to bevel that geometry. Now another tip I have for you here is you can select edge loops. An edge loop exists when you find one point, such as a vertex that has 3 edges, and then you locate another point where a vertex may have 3 edges connected to it. It can also be 5 or 6 edges connected to the same vertex. So long as it's not 4, then it will terminate the pole or the edge loop. What I mean by that is if I hold down the Alt key and left click, it's going to select the edge loop going from the vertex located here in our example, which has 3 edges associated to it, down to this point here. And again, you can see there are 3 edges associated to this specific vertex, which means that Blender doesn't know how to continue the loop, which means that Blender will terminate the loop. Now with that said, we can now use the bevel tool to click and drag and create new geometry. So it's going to split the selection into segments, and it's going to add some curvature based on the original geometry and the angle of the faces connected to the mesh. While using the tool, in which we click and drag to create the bevel, we can also scroll up on our scroll wheel to add segments. This adds even more geometry and even more curvature to the model at that position. So I can release here, for example, left click, and if we just go back into object mode, you can see that we have a much smoother edge on this side. The next tool that we're going to cover is the loop cut tool. Now you can access it here, and if we hover over our mesh, you will see highlighted potential loop cuts that you can create. So just a minute ago, we were talking about the ability to select loops by using Alt and left clicking. Well, the loop cut tool allows us to create brand new loops on our model. So here, for example, I can left click and it's going to generate a new loop that goes all the way around our mesh. The loop can either be complete, as it is in this example, where it goes all the way around, or it can terminate at specific points, depending on the number of edges associated to a vertex. For example, we can create a loop here that terminates both in the center as well as at the bottom. This allows us to create new geometry, which we can select by going into Face Select and then manipulating with other tools. For example, I can create a couple of windows here with the Inset tool, and then I can use extrusions to bring the geometry inwards towards the center of the object. And this allows us to begin creating details by combining multiple tools together in edit mode. An alternative, however, to using the loop cut tool is to use loop cut and slide. And this is a more popular method of the tool. Hold down Control or Command and then press R. This allows you to add a loop cut. You can hover your mouse anywhere you want to add the new geometry. We can also scroll up or scroll down to change the number of segments, which you can also do using the tool in the tool shelf. But what's different is when we left click, we can then reposition or slide our geometry from the loops either side of the generated edges. So I can move it up to this point, or I can move it down to this point. So I might go here, for example, left click, and that allows me to create the new geometry using the loop cut and slide tool. The remaining tools are a little bit more complex to work with, so we're going to pass on those for now. But when it comes to manipulating the geometry of a model, the last thing I want to demonstrate is the ability to delete your geometry. So we can delete geometry by selecting it. For example, we can select this face right here. We can then press the X key to bring up the delete menu. We have multiple options here. Vertices, edges, and faces are the three options that you would typically use. Many of these will do slightly different things. In the case of this area here, I want to delete the face by itself. So I select it, press X, and then the correct option here would be to delete faces. When we delete a face, we maintain the edges and vertices used to create the face. If we were to delete the edges, however, we would delete the face connected to them, and we may also delete other faces that were dependent on those edges. If we were to choose the vertex option for vertices, then again, any faces associated with those vertices would be deleted. That means we may end up deleting geometry that we may want to keep. So in this example, X, delete faces, and we remove that inner face. Let's select this one here, press X, delete faces, and again, it removes the geometry that we want. In most cases, as a beginner, when you're using the delete tool in edit mode, start by deleting the faces, and you should normally get the behavior that you want from the delete tool. Again, if you make a mistake, you can use Ctrl and Z to undo the previous step. We're now going to move on to materials, but before we do that, I want to highlight something that I promised we'd look at earlier on in the course, and that is the object origin. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to remove the object that we have been creating, and I'm going to bring back the monkey object. Now the object origin is the yellow dots that you will typically see at the center of the model. This is what controls your transforms. All you need to know right now is that when you grab, rotate, and scale your model, it uses the object origin as the main point of reference. If you want to move the position of the object origin or the geometry, there are two methods. The first method is to go into edit mode, which I've done by pressing the tab key this time, and then you can move the geometry. So I can press G to select all of my geometry and move it along the x-axis. What this will do is it will move the geometry, but the object origin will remain in the same place. Now, if I was to hit the G key, you would see that both the geometry and the object origin move in the same way, but they maintain the distance between them. Where the behavior really changes is when we use rotation and scale. For example, if I was to rotate on the z-axis, you can see now that the mesh geometry is effectively orbiting the object origin, and it also rotates the geometry itself as we change its positioning. A similar effect can be seen depending on the scale. So if I manipulate the scale on the x-axis, what you'll probably see in this example is one side of the model seems to stretch out a little bit more than the other. But as we continue to scale up, even the closest point of Suzanne's mesh moves further away from the object origin. The other way of manipulating the object origin's position, respective to its geometry, is to go to Options located in the top corner, and then choose to affect only origins. Now, if I press the G key to grab, only the origin will be moved. We're in object mode, by the way, and we can manipulate the object origin's position using this method. We could also manipulate its rotation values, but this will actually affect the model as well. So if we go here, we can affect the origins, but the actual method here is to use this option to affect the location transform specifically. If we manipulate the scale value, you can see we are able to manipulate that scale on all axes, but again, the effect is very similar to just manipulating the model. If you want to make sure that you restore the original functionality, just return to the options menu and turn off the option that allows us to affect the origin only. And if you're in a position where you want to reset this so that the object's origin returns to the center of the geometry, just go to the object menu located here, go to Set Origin, and in this case I want to choose Geometry to Origin because the origin's in a good place and I want to move the geometry back. So choose Geometry to Origin, and it snaps the geometry back to where the object origin is located in the 3D viewport. With that said, it's now time to look at adding materials to our models, and this is going to require the use of different panels and editors. From this point on, we're going to be using the traditional layout workspace. So just click on the Back to Previous option, and this will bring our outliner, our properties panel, and our timeline back into view. For this course, we're only going to be using the layout workspace. We have everything we need within this workspace, so we're not going to be accessing shading for our materials or animation for, you guessed it, animating our geometry at this time. In the layout workspace, we have access to 4 options in the top corner of the 3D viewport. Each of these options changes what we can see in the viewport itself. For the duration of this course, we have been working in solid view, which allows us to view the vertices, edges and faces of our models. The option before it is for wireframe. This effectively removes the faces from view, allowing us to view the wireframe of our mesh. The original option was solid view, which allows us to see the faces. The next option is the material preview, and this creates a default lighting setup in which we will be able to see any materials that we add to the model. The fourth option is the rendered view, and this is great for previewing the lighting conditions that you will see in the final render or animation. For now, we want to use material preview. The easiest way to add a material is to go to the properties panel and come down to this red ball icon. This allows us to access the materials tab. Currently, this area here, which is where we store our materials, is empty. We need to add a material to our object. But before I do that, I want to just make a quick note that if you start a new project, your default cube is going to have a material already assigned to it. For now, we can click on the plus icon and this will add a material slot. This is a location in which a material can be stored. Then we're going to click on the new button and this will add a material within that data slot. I'm going to rename this material. So just left click here where we have the name and we're going to just rename it as red for this example. Now if we take a look below, we have a wide variety of options, but for this tutorial we're only worried with a single parameter, the base color. This will allow us to change the actual color of the model. So I'm going to left click on this color and this will bring up the color wheel. There are many different ways in which you can change the color of your model. Here we can go with the RGB values, which stands for red, green and blue, and we can manipulate the color using these values. Alternatively, we can use hue, saturation and value. Hue represents the color, saturation is the strength of the color, and value is the perceived brightness. Or we can use the color wheel and color slider. So I can just click and drag within the color wheel itself and pick a color. Then I can take the brightness slider and I can make that color brighter or darker. Let's make it a relatively bright reddish pink color, just for the example that we have here. There are other parameters as well that are going to change the properties of our material, but for now all I want you to focus on is the color. Next, we need to cover how to assign materials to different areas of the mesh. In this example, I want to add 2 more materials. Both of these materials are going to be added to the eyes of our Suzanne object. This means I require 2 material slots, which I can do so by left clicking on the plus button. I'm going to select the first material slot and create a new material. I'm going to name this as white. So this is going to be the general color of the eye, and then I'm going to want a color for the pupil. The base color is set to white, and I'm going to make it a bright white. But you'll see that even though we have added a white material, it is not assigned to our geometry. To do this, we're going to go into edit mode and we're going to select the eyes. Now, if you have geometry that is separated in Blender, which is the case with Suzanne and her eyes, you can select these islands by pressing the L key. So if I press L on the eye, we're able to select that geometry. If I press G, you'll see what I mean when I'm referring to islands. So this is a part of the mesh that is disconnected from the rest of the model. I can press L again to add the second eye to our selection. Over in the properties panel, 3 new buttons have appeared: assign, select and deselect. I'm going to choose the white material and then click assign. This allows me to assign the white material to the selected geometry. Now I'm going to repeat the process for the third material. Let's create a blue one. Then let's create a nice deep blue, and then we're going to select the geometry that we want. Now for this example, I'm going to demonstrate another method of selection. If you come to the Select Box tool in the tool shelf, click and hold, it will bring up an additional menu where you can change your method of selection. Here I'm going to go with Circle Select. I can scroll up and down to zoom in, and then I can click and drag, and this will add to my selection. So you'll see there's a little circle, and we can increase the radius if we want up here, and that will increase the size of that circle, which allows us to more easily select our geometry. You should notice as well though that it deselected the original geometry as well. So for this to function correctly, I'm going to have to hold down Shift, left click, and select the geometry that I want. Then choose the blue material and click Assign. Now if we go into Object mode, we will see that we have 3 materials added to Suzanne. The red material, the white material, and the blue material. So now that we have learned how to add materials to our models, and we have also learned how to edit our models, I'm going to create a very simple animation. This is going to introduce the timeline as well as the introduction of keyframes, which are the core tools for traditional animations created in Blender. There are many tools associated with animation, such as the ability to create armatures and rigs for more complex movements. But for the sake of time and simplicity, we're just going to use transforms to help demonstrate the power of animation in Blender. Before we do that, I want to demonstrate another tool that is very useful, and that is the ability to hide our objects from both the 3D viewport and from any renders that we may choose to create. So I don't want to delete Suzanne, I just want to hide it. If we come to the outliner panel, there are 2 icons associated to each object. The eye icon is the visibility toggle in the 3D viewport. The camera icon is the visibility toggle for rendered images. For now, I want to disable both of these for Suzanne. So I'm just going to left click on each of them. And when I do so with the first one, which is the eye, you will see we have now hidden Suzanne from the viewport. The second option will ensure that Suzanne does not accidentally pop up when we do the render. So now we've kept Suzanne in our project, we just can't see it unless we click on these icons to bring it back into view. Now I'm going to set up a scene, and for this scene I'm going to first of all add in a plane object. With this plane object, I want it to be considerably bigger, which we can do so by adjusting the scale values. But another method when we create a model or we use a tool is to access the operator panel. The operator panel is typically located in the bottom corner. So here we've added the plane and we have a series of parameters that we can manipulate. The size is the only one I'm interested in right now. So I can click and drag to adjust the size of the plane area. I'm going to set this to 5 meters. That should be plenty big enough for this example. I'm then going to go into edit mode, and I'm going to make sure that I'm using traditional selection. I'm going to go to edge select, and we're going to select these 2 edges to start with and press E to extrude. So by the way, the E key is the hotkey for extrusion, and you'll see it's a bit loose. So what you can do is you can lock it to the Z axis by pressing Z, and that allows us to bring it up and create a couple of walls. So this is the environment that we're going to be using. And the other thing I want to change is just the use of the bevel here and here. So we're going to select both of these, and we can use the bevel tool here, or we can use the hotkey, which is Control and B. So I'm going to use Control and B to bevel, and you'll also see it remembers the settings from the last time I used the tool. So I'm just going to create a small bevel to create a little bit of curvature where we have the floor and then the walls. Next, we're going to be creating the objects that I'm going to use to demonstrate the animation. I'm going to start things off by creating a cube object, and let's edit some of the dimensions of the cube. So I'm going to scale it down by pressing S and then locking to the Z axis. We'll scale it down to about here. Then I'm just going to bring it up on the Z axis to give us our first cube object. Then I'm going to go into edit mode. I'm going to go face select and select the top face, and then I'm just going to inset it. Now if you want to inset by a specific amount, and by the way, I've activated the inset tool by pressing the I key on my keyboard, so you can either go to inset faces, click and drag, or you can press the I key to activate the same tool. And to get a specific level of inset, just type in a number between 0 and 1. So in my case, I'm going to go, if I go 0.2, then it brings it in by a factor of 0.2 when you consider the original face has a value of 1 in terms of its thickness. If we go the opposite, we can go 0.8, which is about 80 centimeters in this case. That's more of what I want for this example, so I'm just going to press enter, and now we have that new geometry using the inset faces tool. You'll see we have a lot of options in the outliner panel, but I don't need to change anything else at this point. What I am going to do though is I'm just going to delete the face that was just created. So I'm going to create an animation where we have 3 cubes of different sizes stacking on top of each other. I'm going to do that by starting them outside of the camera's view, which we're going to move on to soon, and then bringing them down one by one. So for this model, we are all set to go. So I'm going to create a second model. I'm going to scale it down on all 3 axes. And I think I'm going to scale it down to a value of 0.2 as well. We're going to bring this up on the Z axis, and then we're going to press S, then Z to scale. Now I'm going to scale a little bit, probably to a value of 2.5 on the Z axis, and then press enter. And now if I press G and Z, it should slot down into the original cube. The final one I'm going to create is also going to be a cube, so we're just sticking with these simple models. And again, I'm going to scale on all axes by a value of 0.3. Press enter. Then I'm just going to bring it up by using G and Z. Bring it up towards the top to about here. So this is going to be the final positioning of our 3 objects, give or take. But I want to animate this so that they all fall down one by one into view. You will notice that we are currently using material preview, and this is actually good because I can just add my materials now. So with the main area, which is the floor and the walls, I'm going to add my first material. And we can just make this a green material, give it a green color. And with each of these objects, I'm just going to give it a unique color so that it's easy to see in our project. So the first cube at the bottom is going to be a pink material. The second cube is going to be a blue material. And you can see we actually already have a blue material from this project, but that's fine. By the way, if you want to access existing materials, you can just click on the menu right next to it, and this will give you all of the materials that are used and active within the project. If you see a 0 next to a material, that means that if you close your project, that material will be deleted. So even if you save the project as a whole and then close Blender, any materials that have this 0 assigned next to them will be deleted. So just keep that in mind. For now, I'm going to choose actually the blue material, since that's already got the base color set up. And let's also choose a red material for the final cube. So now we have 3 cubes in a very simple scene. And as I mentioned before, the idea is going to be to have all of these fall down into our scene. I'm going to select all 3 of these objects to start with, hit G and Z, and just move them above. Now I'm going to want to view my scene through the eyes of my camera. If you'll remember, that required us to press 0 on our number pad or click this button right here. So at the moment, this is our camera's view. And if I want to change the camera view, all I need to do is go to the side panel, and if the side panel is currently closed, which I can do by pressing N, you can just press N again to open it up, and then you'll see a series of tabs. Here I'm going to pick the View tab, and then under View Lock, I'm going to lock Camera to View. Now if I begin to orbit around my scene, it will also move the camera. So for this example, I'm just going to zoom in a little bit, maybe not too much, and just angle the camera so that we'll get a better view of the objects as they fall in. When I'm done positioning the camera, I just untick the box and orbit out of view. But now we move on to the ability to animate our objects in Blender. So I'm going to start by just bringing up my timeline a little bit, and you'll see that we have a frame range to work with, and we can change this frame range at any point, but for now it's set to 250 frames, and this is going to be absolutely fine for our example. There's a blue line that will indicate the current frame that you are on. So at the moment we're on frame 1, and we can scrub through the timeline to any point in the animation. But at the moment there is no animation, so we need to start creating them. I'm going to select my pink cube here first of all, and I'm going to add what is known as a keyframe. The traditional method of animating an object in Blender is to create a start and end keyframe. The start is the original positioning and the end is the target position. Blender will then animate the motion between the 2 values. In practice, that looks like this. We've currently got our cube selected, and I'm going to press the I key on my keyboard. This is going to add a keyframe to my first cube. Now this isn't going to do anything because there's no change in the information, there's no end keyframe. The first keyframe, which is the start, isn't going to have any effect on the model. What we want to do, however, is we want to change the frame first of all. So I'm going to go to frame 80. Then we're going to move our object. So I'm going to lock it to the Z axis and move it down until it just about sits just above our plane directly underneath. If I go to the Item tab, you'll see that all of the transforms have been given colors. Green indicates a transform that has a keyframe added to it at another point in the timeline that we're not currently on. C is orange. This indicates that a keyframe was added, but the value has been changed. If I go back to frame 1, what you'll see is that the change in location has been reset. You can also see that we have yellow colours across the board for all of our transforms. So this indicates that on the current frame, a keyframe has been added. Again, I'm going to return to frame 80, and you'll see that the positioning hasn't changed. So when you add keyframes to your objects, remember that making any changes to that information and then changing the frame again is going to reset the changes you made. Here, we're going to bring it back down on the Z-axis to about here. Actually, maybe just a tiny bit higher. And then we're going to press I a second time. This is going to add a new keyframe at the current point in the animation. So we now have 2 keyframes, one here and one here. If we go back to frame 1, we can press the play button on our timeline here, and this is going to drop the plane or drop the cube down into its new position. So this is really the absolute basics of creating animations in Blender. You have a start frame and an end frame, and then Blender will fill the space between based on the value that has been animated. So now let's go to frame 80, and at this point we're going to add a keyframe to our second cube. Another way of creating a keyframe is to just find the value within Blender's user interface. So here, the only actual value that we're changing is going to be the Z location. As a result of this, all I need to do is actually press the I key, and the location transforms exclusively will have keyframes added to them. So all 3 axes will have a keyframe added, but you'll notice that the rotation and scale do not have keyframes at this point. Now I'm going to move to another frame, which is going to be frame 160, and you'll notice that only one keyframe is visible in the timeline. So the one we created at the first frame has disappeared, and that's because the keyframes that you see within the timeline are related to the objects that you have selected. So here we're going to move our blue cube down until it just about overlaps with the pink one. Then we're going to hover over our location transform and press the I key. This will add an end keyframe for the blue cube's animation. Coming back down to the timeline, I can use these endpoint markers. Just left click and it will jump to either the start or end of the selected frame range. If I press play, you'll see that the original cube falls down first, and then the second. So now that we've done that, let's add one more animation for the third and final cube. We're going to do this at frame 160, and here we'll just come back to our location value and press the I key. Then we're going to move to frame 240. We're going to click and drag on the location and bring it down until it overlaps the second cube. You'll notice that I didn't create a hole at the bottom. And the reason why I created a hole on the pink cube but not the red one is because with the pink cube we're going to see that hole, but for the red cube we're not. You don't need to make changes to scenes like this in areas where the camera is not going to pick up on that geometry. We could have just as easily decided to remove the bottom face entirely if we wanted. But moving back to the creation of the animation itself, hover back to the side panel where we have the Z value and press the I key once again to create the keyframe. Now, if we go back to the starting frame, which is frame 1, we can press play and it will run through our generated animation, dropping down 1 cube each time. So now that we have done the animation step, let's move on to the setup for our render. And the first stage of the setup is to preview through the camera and make sure the lighting is what we want. So let's start with the camera. If you'll recall, we can click on this button right here to move into the camera view. I'm then going to go back to the start and press play to preview how the animation appears as we look through the eyes of the camera. So that looks absolutely fine to me. The next step is going to be to view the lighting. So I'm just going to move to frame 248, something like that, so I can see all of the geometry in the scene. And then I'm going to move to rendered view. Now here we can preview how our scene is going to look when we render our image or animation. If we go to the properties panel, there's a tab labeled as render. The very first option is the render engine. There are two options here, Eevee and Cycles. You can ignore Workbench in most cases, but Eevee and Cycles are the ones you'll choose. Eevee is for speed, Cycles is for realism. Cycles is a much more complicated render engine, and there are a lot more tools in which you can work with. Eevee is much simpler. There are still a lot of tools available, including things like ray tracing. And all of these will add to the computational time of your rendered images. But the idea of Eevee is to just turn it on and exploit the incredible speed that it offers when rendering your geometry. So here we have it set up so that we are using the Eevee render engine. And now we can just preview this within our scene. So you'll see that in rendered view, we're generating some shadow here. And there are ways in which we can improve this for sure, such as going into our shadows section and improving the number of rays and steps, for example. But keep in mind that this is also something that's quite intensive and will take a few seconds each time you manipulate these kinds of values. But it is going to increase the overall quality of that specific part of the scene. So in this case, we increase the number of rays generated, and that's going to increase the shadow quality. There are many other options here, but for now, let's just preview what we've got in our 3D viewport. So the animation is taking effect where we're just dropping each of our cubes down one by one until the end of the animation. So that's pretty reasonable for a test render. What we're going to do now is we're going to actually render a single image. So we can either render an image or we can render an animation. To render an image, first of all, make sure you're on the frame for the image that you want to render. If we start on frame 1 and render an image, all we're going to see here is the green backdrop. If I want to see everything, I need to move to at least frame 240, which is where the final cube moves into position. So any of these frames will do. And then what I can do is I can just go to the render menu located in the top corner of the interface and choose the render image option. I can also use a hotkey, which is F12. So left click that, and a new window will appear in which your image is going to be rendered. Now this does not save the image, and if you save the project and exit, you will not save the image itself. So what you need to do is you just need to go to the image menu, choose save as, and then name your image. So here, let's just name it first IMG, and then choose save as image here. This is how you would save any images that you create in Blender. So that's how we render an image, but what about an animation? Well, to render our animation, let's first go to frame 1, and if we go to the render menu again, we can see that we have the option to render an entire animation. So this is going to render our scene from frame 1 to frame 250, because that's the defined range. By the way, you can change this range by just clicking on any of the start or end values and dragging side to side. So here, if I was to decrease the end value to underneath 240 frames, then we wouldn't actually get the finished result of our animation because the keyframe exists outside of the frame range. For now, we're just going to keep these settings as is. Before we can click on the render animation option, we need to return to the properties panel, and we're going to locate the output tab. It looks kind of like a printer. So left click, and here you'll be able to determine things like the resolution of your output render or animation. You can determine the frame rate from this option here. You can also determine the start and end frames for the frame range. But perhaps most importantly to us, we have the output. Now here we can define a location for our rendered animation as well as the file format. Because we're about to render an animation, we're going to change the file format to FFmpeg video. It should be noted that if you're using the Cycles render engine, a much better workflow is to actually render an image sequence, which you can do by using an image format like PNG. And then, once all of those images are rendered, you can convert that image sequence into a movie file. The reason why this workflow is done in Cycles is because Blender may crash at any time, or you may need to pause the animation or the rendering of it. And if you come back at any point, you'll realize that you would actually have to start again if you were just rendering it as a single movie file. So it's much better in a lot of cases when using Cycles to render images first and then convert that image sequence into a movie file. But because we're using Eevee and it's going to go a lot quicker, we're just going to choose the movie file right from the get-go. We can come down to the encoding section here and we can define the container. I like to use MPEG-4 and then the video codec. For this, I'm going to use H.264. You can define things like the output quality, such as the medium quality setting, low quality, lossless, etc. The higher up this list you go, the better the quality is going to be. So I'm going to go high quality for this. And we also have our encoding speed settings. Choose whichever one you like, depending on how quickly you would like each frame to render, but for now, we're going to keep it at the good setting. At this point, we've got almost everything set up. I just need to define the output location of the new file. Currently, it's set to a temporary folder, but I'm going to change it so that we can actually save to an appropriate location. So here, let's go and create a new folder called Animate1. We're going to open this up and then choose Accept. So now I have a defined location for my animation, and that's another tip, especially if you're going to create an image sequence first. You should beforehand create a dedicated empty folder to render an animation into. At this point, we've got everything set up, so now I'm going to go to Render and Render Animation. This is going to animate or render each of our frames one by one, starting from frame 1 and finishing at frame 250. Once that is completed, your animation will have been saved to your output. Now it's important to note that you don't have to, for an animation, save the animation from image save as. This is the process for saving an individual render. For animations, we use the output to define the location, and once it's complete, it will save to that location. So now all you should need to do is locate the folder from which you created to store that new file. I'm using Windows, so I've just located the folder. I'm going to access the folder itself, and here is my MP4 file. So I'm going to double click, and it should open my media player, from which after a few seconds of loading, it will play the animation. And here we go. So obviously it's a very low quality animation, because we've only really added a few basic animations to our cubes and there's not a lot else we've edited, but this should pretty much cover the absolute fundamentals of how to create an animation in Blender and how to render that animation using the Eevee render engine. The final thing I want to show you today in this beginner's guide is how you can change the light itself. So we're just going to close this, and I'm just going to move to frame 249, that will do. And you can see here we have the light object. Now, to keep things simple, we didn't manipulate the light object for our animation, but just to finish, you can click and drag or press the G key to move the light around your scene, and you'll notice in real time that this is going to change the direction of the light and shadows. So you can manipulate the positioning of your light to change the look of your scene when viewed through the camera. You can also change the settings of the light, such as the brightness, by coming to the Data tab for the object itself, which should appear as a light bulb when the light is selected. You can then determine things like the type of light that you're using, such as point, sun, spot, and area. You can change the color. So here we might want to create a sort of yellowish hue. We can also determine things like the power. This represents how bright that light source is going to be. So if I bring this all the way down, it reduces the amount of light that is projected onto the objects in our scene. We can also determine things like fall off, radius for the sharpness of our shadows and where the light hits the models, the inclusion of shadows, which we can toggle here based on the shadows that are going to be created from this specific light source, along with several other options. So you can take some time to improve your rendered animation by just manipulating things like the lighting, maybe change the color, change the power, maybe improve some of the settings in the Eevee section, but do whatever you want, just experiment with it and just get used to the different areas of Blender. But as for today's course, that pretty much wraps things up. So we've covered all of the need to know stuff to get you started as a newbie with Blender 3D. From this point, I advise you to look at many other tutorials, documentation, and most importantly, just practice. Just start getting used to Blender. There is so much to learn, but it's every bit about creating good habits as it is learning the tools themselves. So experiment with new tools, new workflows, new systems, and just get used to using Blender 3D. It really is an amazing application, especially considering it's so accessible. But that's it from me today. I hope you've enjoyed this video course. If you have, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notifications bell icon for updates on future tutorials and courses available right here on the YouTube platform. For now, see you later.